Today I'm talking with Christie Matherne. She is the editor of Wallet Hub, and Wallet Hub did something really unique. It commissioned a study to look at the best states and rank the best states for racial equality and civic engagement. And what an important study to release at this time, particularly given our upcoming national presidential election, all of the important Senate races and the House of Representative races, all of the important local races that are taking place. I'm so excited to be joined by Christine today as we are leading into the big presidential election tomorrow. So it'll be interesting to see if the ranking of the states for racial equality and civic engagement, what relationship we may see in terms of those states' participation, i.e. watching the election tomorrow. I'm sorry, I called her Christine. Her name is Christie. Thank you, Christie, for joining me. Thank you, Wallet Hub, for doing this important work. Let's start with the motivation. Christie, what was the motivation for Wallet Hub to actually commission this kind of study?
Well, we picked this topic for racial equality has been a prominent and important issue lately, as well as in light of protests about police brutality, which gave way to wider discussions on race relations. And through these statistics, we are attempting to measure the degree to which Black Americans have fewer opportunities to engage politically and socially, and which states have more or less disparity.
So, civic engagement, big term, two words, but for folks who maybe don't readily identify with what it means to be civically engaged or what civic engagement is, define for us what that is, for the purposes at least of this study.
Sure. Well, civic engagement in terms of this study is voter turnout rates, like your participation in elections, volunteer rates, like this is a part of social engagement and social participation. And we also measured the rate of veterans, so like participation in civic duty, almost like this this duty to country. So that's kind of what we were measuring here.
And how many people? So when I think about how when you're ranking states, obviously that's a lot of folks you've got to talk to compare, California to New York to Florida. So what was the process by which your researchers used to actually come up with this ranking? I'm going to share the ranking, but I want to make sure people have a really good understanding of how you got to this ranking, because I think people are going to be shocked to hear where their state falls on this chart. So what was the process by which they used to get to these, these numeric rankings?
Well, actually, all of this data is from the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and the Corporation for National and Community Service. So this is all hard data.
So this is publicly available data. So your researchers just took that data that was out there and obviously used some kind of a equation or algorithm or something to come up with some comparative analysis. Is that what happened?
Right. So we're measuring rates with these things. We are like basically turning it into a percentage versus so obviously there are varying degrees of populations in different states. So we are comparing apples to apples here with percentages.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, what the rankings are, because again, when I looked at these states, I was like, very interesting. Let's start with the first state. And I guess when I look at this chart, overall ranking, the number one state on here is Arizona. And then number two is New Mexico. Both of those shocking to me. 3 is Maryland. I'm not so surprised. I am surprised California is number 5. I would expect us to be top 10, maybe even 1 or 2. But talk to us about Arizona and New Mexico as 1 and 2.
So across the 5 metrics that we measured, by metrics, I mean, we measured gaps between Black and white residents overall in the rate of single parent households, the rate of adults on parole, the rate of veterans, volunteer rates, and voter turnout rates for presidential elections. So
Mm.
all of these top states, like Arizona is first because it averaged the best. It ended up with the best grade out of all of these five metrics.
Yeah, here's some interesting, again, stats from this report, particularly going into this presidential election that's happening in November. So you measured voter turnout rate gap. So the highest is Colorado, 32,
Mhm.
Oregon at 33. So what does it mean when you say the highest and then Colorado comes in at 32? What does that mean about voter turnout in Colorado?
That it's wait, that it's 32nd in that category. Is that what you said?
Right. I'm looking at the chart on
Uh-huh.
voter turnout rate gap. And it's
Hmm.
under highest, it has Colorado 32, Oregon 33, Iowa 34, Wisconsin
Oh,
35. And
yes. Okay. So the 32 actually represents the fact that we had a pretty big tie in that category. So if you look at the lowest, there's a tie for first between Mississippi, Maryland, Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. And so that kind of skews the total number. And we must have had another tie down that line too.
but so let's talk about the tie between Mississippi, Maryland, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Tennessee. That's the lowest. So does that mean these five states that the voter turnout amongst people of color is the lowest in these states?
Yes, that the gap is the lowest. So roughly, I mean, this is without looking at the numbers here, roughly the same amount of black voters percentage wise turn out as white voters. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. So the lowest gap means so Mississippi, if you're voter, white voter and black voters in Mississippi turn out pretty much about at the same rate.
Yes, it's possible that it's even just a little bit lower than the same rate, but they all tied for first, so that means they got the same score.
Okay. And so again, that means there's a small gap in between voter turnout amongst black and white voters in these states. I just want to make sure I'm reading that correctly.
That's exactly right.
Well, that's good news because that says
Mhm.
my state of Missouri has very high black voter turnout because it's tied here as the lowest. So that means the gap between black and white voters in Missouri is pretty small. Uh,
Mhm.
again, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just agreeing with you. It's great.
Oh, okay. Mississippi, that's kind of interesting to think that black and white voters are turning out at the same rate in Mississippi. I wouldn't have expected to see that. I'm not so surprised
Right.
by Maryland, Pennsylvania's on here, and Tennessee. Any of
Mhm.
those surprising to you or your researchers?
I think in this entire study that, yes, a lot of these results are surprising to me, especially because you think there might be some kind of regional trend here, or like in a lot of the studies that we do, sometimes we'll see a coastal sort of trend going on, or like a southern trend. In this study, it's all over the place. So for voter turnout, yeah, it did surprise me that Mississippi was so equitable. But it's this is the data. So,
And then here's something else surprising to me. Massachusetts is on the highest, meaning that the equitable turnout of black and whites is high in Massachusetts. You think of this super liberal state where voters are highly engaged. It's a democratic state. I'm surprised. So that's a surprise to me. Did that strike you as odd that Massachusetts would have this high rate this gap, this large gap between black and white voters?
yes, it's definitely surprising. And one thing I noted that Massachusetts showed up again on the lower gap scale is in the share of adult population on parole. So roughly the same percentage of Black people are on parole as adults as white people in Massachusetts. So that's another factor to take into account. these things aren't all measuring the same thing. So it's interesting to look at how different states do in different categories.
Yeah, I'm looking at the volunteer rate gap. Again, very interesting category that they measured. So the gap, i.e., the smallest gap between black and white volunteers,
Mhm.
states like New Jersey, tied for first place, Washington, Minnesota, West Virginia. Now that's shocking.
Yes.
Maine and Idaho. So again, this number means if you're a black person in Maine, you're a white person in Maine, you all are volunteering at about the same rate.
Hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what that means. And it's somewhat important to note that it's one of our experts that we interviewed for this study to help us add context to this data, mentioned that increasing the volunteer rate in any state could be helped by possibly requiring students to volunteer when they're in high school. So it is possible that some of these states have rules like that in place. So it could be the case. We did not look specifically at that. We just checked the volunteer rate.
Yeah, another category that you measured, gap in share of single parent households. So again, hardly any gap in the number of black versus white single parent households in states like Montana, Idaho, Maine, New Mexico, New Hampshire. Now I wonder, Christy, does this have anything to do with the low number of black folks that live in states like Montana, Idaho, Maine? I wonder how much of that is driving, these numbers.
That's an interesting point to make. So when we did this study, we did push all these numbers into percentages so that that was at least apples to apples. But another expert that we interviewed for this study to add context to that specifically, he mentioned that, and this is from Jermaine McNair of East Carolina University. He's a sociology instructor. He hypothesized that the four states in the top 10 for this study have less than 10% of an African American population, and that high civic engagement levels there could be a result of assimilation, which tends to happen more frequently when the minority group is disproportionately small. So that is a point that it's a good point to make.
What did he mean by that happens when there's assimilation? Explain that a little more.
That that minority groups tend to adopt culture and customs of a larger majority group when the minority group is disproportionately small.
Okay, so when you look at that the states on the top 10, you said the first four, Arizona, New Mexico, but that wouldn't be true of Maryland, would it? I mean,
Oh
Maryland
no,
has a,
no, it's not the top four. It is four states out of the top 10. So it
oh, I
wasn't
got it. Okay.
necessarily those four.
Okay, so probably states like Arizona, New Mexico, maybe Maine is in the top 10, maybe
Yeah.
Delaware.
Mm.
Delaware. So smaller black populations, he says, the sociologist, one of your experts said, you tend to see that smaller group of black folks assimilating, adopting the culture of the majority group. So in layperson's terms, it just means if you're in a state like Arizona and there are a small number of black folks, you're going to see the black folks doing pretty much the same things that the white folks in that state are doing. So if the white folks are volunteering, the black folks are going to more likely than not volunteer. If the white folks are voting in large numbers, you may see large swaths of the small black population that's there, again, modeling, assimilating, doing those same things that the white population is doing. Very interesting. Again, some of
Mm.
the findings of this report, states like California and the overall rankings coming in number 5, a state like New Jersey on this list is 14. State like Missouri, my home state, is 18. Really fascinating.